Mr. Childers?
Present.
Dr. Dempsey?
Present.
Dr. Fleming?
Present.
Ms. Janeski?
Present.
Mr. McKinney?
Present.
Dr. Graham?
Present.
Ms. Hyatt? Dr. Houston? Mrs. Jones?
Here.
Mr. Lockus? Dr. Locklear?
said-
Oh, Mr. Lockus.
No, sorry, I thought you said Megan Loftus. Nope.
Dr. Locklear? Miss Loftus?
Here.
Dr. Marr?
Here.
Dr. McIntyre? Dr. Miller?
Here.
Dr. Weddington? Dr. Wood?
Here. Dr. Evans, I think Dr. Weddington is on. I don't know if he's muted or what, but I see him listed on the attendees and the go-to meeting panel.
It said something about him leaving the meeting, but maybe he had to reconnect.
Okay, well, we're going to, do we have a quorum?
We do have quorum.
All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome commission members, advisors, staff, on-site visitors, and online listeners to the October 11th, 2018 meeting of the North Carolina Professional Educator Preparation and Standards Commission. This Standards Commission develops and recommends to the State Board of Education rules related to all aspects of educator preparation programs. I'm Patrick Miller, and I'm chairman of the Professional Educator Prep Standards Commission, and I call this meeting to order. Our agenda and materials are available online through the DPI website, www.ncpublicschools.org, on the SBE meetings link. The meeting is also audio streamed through a link located at the bottom of the e-board agenda. I will now read the ethics statement that is required of us. Commission members are reminded that it is our duty to avoid conflicts of interest and the appearance of conflicts of interest as we handle the work of this commission. Does any member of the commission know of any conflict of interest or any appearance of conflict with respect to any matters coming before us at this meeting? If so, please state them for the record. If during the course of the meeting you become aware of an actual or apparent conflict of interest, please bring the matter to the attention of the chair. It will then be your duty to abstain from participating in discussion on the matter and from voting on the matter. Commission members, you have had an opportunity to review the proposed agenda for today's meeting. Do I have a motion to approve this agenda for the October 11th, 2018 meeting? And please remember to state your name with your motion.
Ellen McIntyre, so moved.
Thank you, Ellen. We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Anthony Graham, second.
Thank you, Dr. Graham. We have a motion and a second to approve today's agenda. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? The agenda has been approved. Thank you. The minutes from our previous commission meeting on September 24th, 2018 have been prepared and made available to you. Do I have a motion to approve these minutes?
I'll make a motion.
Thank you. And we have a motion. Do we have a second?
Joe Childers, second the motion.
Thank you, sir. We have a motion and a second to approve the minutes from September 24th. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? The minutes have been approved. Thank you. The next item on the agenda is the DPI staff updates and discussion. I will call on Dr. Evans to provide the Board of Education updates and one item for rediscussion.
Good morning, Commission members. This morning I'm going to just review the first item on the Pepsi report. I presented that on October 3rd, and it's the report for the past year from September 1st, 2017 to September 1st, 2018. And after it was presented, it had all the meetings and all the information about the meetings. There were no questions from the board, and they highly complimented the commission for all their work and efforts during this past year. So it should be approved this coming month. Are there any questions? Thank you.
No, ma'am. You want to move into the next item under the updates, the
Yes, please.
presentation. You ready for that?
Yes.
All right, so we will, at this time, welcome Ms. Lynn Maker. She's a consultant for school psychology to North Carolina DPI, and she's going to do about a 10-minute presentation on national certification for school psychologist credential. Ms. Maker, it's all yours.
Good morning. Thank you, everyone, and good morning, members of the commission. I am waiting for the screen to pull up, but I believe everyone can see the slides that are on the webinar meeting at this time. Again, my name is Lynn McCore. I'm the consultant for school psychology. I'm also a licensed school psychologist practicing in the state for almost 20 years. And I am going to try to just provide some contextual information around our why, our what, and our how regarding the national credentialing for school psychologists and recognition in the state of North Carolina. Okay, it's not advancing. Slide. So, as you all probably know, the training requirements and our training programs are on this first slide that you're seeing. Our programs in the state, we have 5, and actually they're great training programs. They are all approved by our National Association of School Psychologists, which means that they meet the highest threshold of training for school psychologists in the country. And it's a real easy slide in for any school psychologist going through those training programs to obtain their license in our state. You can see on the right-hand side of the slide our licensure requirements are completion of an approved program at the 6th-year level and the attaining score of 147 on the praxis in school psychology, and then, of course, our license that's actually issued through the State Board of Education as the licensing authority. Up there. And so I just want to kind of clarify some of the optics around school psychology when we're talking about it, because it is sometimes in my conversations with many folks across the state, especially school level leadership, that there is, and I'm sorry, there were some additional slides that I added that didn't show up in this. In this part of the presentation, but our practice here in this state is guided by the professional standards and our practice model, as well as our general statute and our State Board of Ed policy. So when we are looking at what feeds into our practice standards, we see that these 3 feeders in the state of North Carolina are what we come out with in terms of our professional practice. And what complicates things are district level expectations and the things that surround our workforce reality. This is my version, right? I have to go with this one. And just to, again, give this context of what one slice of psychological services looks like in our state, the assessment slice of services is what many people conclude are completely associated with the school psychological service delivery model. And just to give you some data on what the assessment service piece looks like, based on some data that we had from 2016-17, there were about 740 psychologist practitioners that were providing the direct services across our schools in the state. And when we look at our initial referral data and our re-eval data and our pre-K data, we can see that there were about 30,000 initial referrals that flowed through a school psychologist practitioner as far as fulfilling the requirement of at least a psychological evaluation and the report writing slice of the initial referrals. We do not have really good streamlined data to connect the dots on psychologists and pre-K evaluations and the re-evals that they were involved with, but we can expect that there were a large number of those as well. So when we see that we have an imbalance of our practitioners and the assessments that are required of psychologists, it often leads to a false narrative around the assessment service practice model only. And just stating that assessments, some facts about assessments, they're very important. When we do them of quality, they support good instructional decisions, and we should be doing them. But they are part, but not all, of the skill set. So just trying to position us within the different types of practice models that exist and get us to the why in North Carolina our practice model needs to be given some attention. The assessment-based practice model on this slide, you can see that the student access to this type of practice is typically our students who are in special ed programs or referred for special ed programs. And the majority of time in that model is spent conducting evaluations. This may be, for those of you who have ever engaged with the school psychologist, many school systems across our state, this is their level of engagement with the service delivery that many school psychologists are facing due to our numbers. The comprehensive service delivery model is where students have equitable access, if needed, to the services that the school psychologist provides. What that translates to is when we don't have equitable access for all of our students, we have 1,552,638 students as of last year's data across our state. It doesn't mean that a school psychologist is going to see every one of those students, but the practice model that we are to adhere to suggests that students should have equitable access if needed to those services. What ends up being on the assessment-based model is numbers-wise about 300,000 students. That is our most recent child count data in the state. We have about 300,000 students with IEPs across our state, and unfortunately, due to our numbers, our service delivery is limited to a very small subset of our student population. And so the training and background, just to situate our thinking, is should be around what school psychologists are trained in, which is, of course, learning, behavior, mental health, and the systems level work. And it's really important to distinguish the difference between systems level and student level services, because they are heavily trained in the big picture systems level. And so it's not just that school psychologists should be seeing every student, but they should also be accessible within their system to help with database problem solving, establishing systems of evidence-based programs and interventions, and being able to evaluate the delivery of services across the majority of the students in the building. So there's a lot of systems level work that school psychs are trained in, and then there's, of course, the student level services. And as I referenced earlier, the unfortunate circumstance that we're in our state is that most of the student level services are surrounding referrals and evaluations. But our practice model laid out in this slide shows the 10 domains of practice that school psychologists are trained in, and they are the domains that our 5 training programs in the state operate around within their delivery of their training, and they're also the domains of training that are encompassed in the national Credential training programs. And then when we look at our state standards that were approved by the State Board of Education in 2009, we're 9 years in to the change in the standards. The requirement is that all students have equitable access to these services. So that has been the charge that was approved since October 2009, that school psychological services be accessible to any student within any system that needs them. And we still have a very long way to go to get there. These are our data that helps to establish. I know that there's been a lot of communication with our state association to members of this commission. So I'm just giving you the data points here very quickly of what our numbers look like as of last year's data, that we had 782 and a quarter employed full-time in our state. That's to that 1,552,638 students. Almost 39 of those positions were not direct service delivery positions. They were director type positions or coordinator of school psychological services. So they were not actually servicing students directly. Those positions are created to help establish the systems level work. And so when we adjust the total, we really had about 743.4 school psychologists that were actually working directly with students, which leaves our ratio at that one school psychologist to almost 2,100. And that's what it looks like in comparison to the national model. The national model recommends, based on those national standards of practice, and which translate down into our state standards that were approved by the Board of Ed 9 years ago, that 1 to 700 ratio is what is recommended in order to be able to deliver and provide equitable access to those services. Where we're at this as of last year, and it's been hanging around this for the past 4 years that I've been tracking the data in this position, it is 3 times that recommended ratio. So that helps to establish the why, and there is still some additional data that shows how I've mapped out by regional distribution what our school psychologist workforce looks like based on the 8 education districts laid out by the State Board of Ed. And you can see that they're pretty much hanging around. We have some areas of the state that the average is a little bit lower than that 1 to 2,100, but then the majority of regions across the state have that way above the 1 to 700 ratio. I also have a slide in here that just illustrates those districts that have less than 1 full-time equivalent of school psychologists employed within their district. So that's laid out. We had last year 13 districts that did not employ school psychologists, and then we had many that were they were partially employed or they were contracted positions. So they're all listed by region on the slide that you have before you right now. So just some additional data points to consider when we're looking at the context of service delivery and the problems like that we really face in the state around our service delivery. And these were the vacancies that were reported to me last year. We had about 75 vacancies, and that's not accounting for capacity building, but just gaps that existed in their existing positions across the state, and the distribution of that by region. So what we work to try to accomplish is addressing this as a multifaceted, complex issue that is not going to change overnight. And one of the things that we have identified is, first we need to look at closing the employment gap. So really filling the holes that exist in our state. As of what I knew last year, there were 75 holes. So we need to stop that and then look at building capacity. The ways to do that, we've identified really looking at increasing student enrollment in our existing 5 training programs. Our institutes of higher education and I work very well together. We're very collaborative and we communicate openly, and I've been tracking their data, and they have been doing a stellar job in getting their cohort sizes filled with quality individuals, not sacrificing quality for quantity. But I have seen over the past 2 years the cohorts increase, so we will be hopefully producing more. What we want to do is place those interns within their last year of study is a pretty much a 1,200-hour internship placement as like practicing as a intern in the public school system. We want them in our state. We want those interns to be placed in our state and not go out of state for their internships. So we're working on helping to secure those, and I know our local districts are offering stipends and things like that to be able to support that. So we have been working towards those two ends. The other issue is that out-of-state recruitment effort that we really need to address, because our five training programs are necessary but not sufficient to close the employment gaps. And then you could see some other strategies that we need to address overall in the big picture to improve the staffing ratio over time. But I'll focus on the recruitment efforts because that's what this credential is really about. Like I said, our training programs are necessary but not sufficient. We have been watching, and we have about 4 states in our country that are producing a surplus of school psychologists that cannot find jobs. There's not enough jobs for how many school psychologists they're producing. So we really want to set our eyes on those states as well as others. But those 4 states have a lot of training programs, and we often do get applicants from those states. What they run into is sometimes challenges in the nuances that exist between the training programs and the licensure. So what was created by our national association was this credentialing system, the certification system to recognize the highest standard for credentialing of school psychologists across the country, because our National Association of School Psychologists back in 1989 recognized that there's a need that we understand that school psychologists who meet national standards, we need to be able to recognize them in a way that is consistently applied across the country, because there is a wide range of credentialing requirements that exist from state to state. The goals of this system that our National Association established are up there, and those are some of the goals that they've established. And one of them was to create a uniform credentialing standard, set of standards across states, and then to be able to help facilitate easy, streamlined processes for school psychologists to help in areas where the pipeline is a problem, as well as some of the other goals that you see up there. Excuse me. So when we compare our North Carolina training requirements to the nationally certified school psych credential, you can see that they are a one-to-one match in training, and they're a one-to-one match in testing. Our state has a very high minimum standard for training of school psychologists, as you can see, and as evidenced by the 5 training programs in our state, that they're all approved by our National Association. And so this national credential exists as a one-to-one match for what we require here in the state of North Carolina. And this is just some of the information from the infographic. And, we have about 25,000 school psychologists across the country based on their national estimates over the past year. And about 60% of those actually hold a national, the credential for it to be nationally certified. There's some more kind of like tidbits of information as part of their infographic. I'm not sure if this was ever shared, but I figured I'd just put it in some slides because this is what our National Association kind of underscores as the selling points for this national credential. And the one thing that we're here talking about today is, that we're not in any pioneering effort on this, that the majority of states at this point in our country have recognized the national credential as a pathway to state level certification. There's 32 states across the country that have already recognized this and help to license their applicants in this way. And you can see up there on this next slide that we have, of those 32 states, we have competition right around us. We have Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia that are included in those 32 states, so they already recognize the credential, and we are at a competitive disadvantage when we don't have that yet in place. And what happens is that when someone from outside of our state is looking in through the national network, there's a tab that you can go to pull up the 32 states. And applicants from out of state who hold this national credential will often go to that tab, they'll see those states, and then they'll set their eyes on those states, and it immediately wipes out North Carolina in their job searches. And what's interesting is that those states that are training a surplus, they don't recognize the national credential, and probably because they don't really need to. Like, they're training a surplus, and so they don't have recognition of it. Pennsylvania, Texas, California, and New York, and it's because I would hypothesize that they're training a surplus, so they're not at a loss for seeking applicants like some of our other states are, including North Carolina. And so the recruitment opportunities that truly exist with this is to be able to I have access to national networks where I market our workforce and our beautiful state from the East Coast to the West. In the mountains, and really illustrate kind of job openings that exist across the state, so any applicant can look at our state and determine, do I want to be in the mountains, do I want to be on the coast, do I want to be somewhere in between in a more metropolitan area. And they could see what job openings exist. And I typically blast that out across the national networks to really try and market the recruitment efforts that we need to establish in this state. So that's a real easy win to be able to do that. And the other pieces is, that our frequently accessed websites that I just referenced, our national website that most job seekers go to look at what's out there and how states credential. They can quickly add us to that list, and that will put us in a more prioritized list of considerations for anybody outside of North Carolina looking in to consider a move, which there are many from those 4 states. Mostly from New York and Pennsylvania is where I hear a lot of our applicants coming from, but we do have some from California and Texas as well. So just to lay out how there could be some real targeted communication efforts to those states training a surplus, and you could see the National Association keeps a registry of each state's total number of nationally credentialed school sites, and those are the numbers in each of those states that hold the national credential that we would want to look to and recruit with this effort. And then I just linked some slides, some resources at the end of this presentation, and I'm happy to answer any additional questions that may have come up to underscore the how.
Dr. Miller, this is Linda Jones. I just have a couple of questions and a few comments. Is now the time for that?
Sure.
Lynn, thank you for a great presentation. I appreciate all that information. Do you have any idea, or maybe Tom, I think you're on the line, do you have any idea how many applicants or applications we have for licensure this year for school psychologists?
I do not have those data. I do believe there were some data presented at the State Board of Ed meeting that might be in the agenda. On current licenses, I do not know. Dr. Evans, did you want to speak to that?
So, Glenda, I'll be talking about this next, but licensure exam data. So from July 1st, 2017 to June 30th, 2018, NCDPI issued 78 school psychologist licenses.
Any idea how many are in the queue right now to be processed?
I do not.
0.
Okay.
This is Tom Doberman. Yes, there are currently no pending. I'm sorry, this is Tom Doberman. There are currently, as of earlier this week, Monday, there were no pending school psychologist licenses in the system.
Do you know how many teachers are pending in the system right now across the state?
That's a harder number to come up with. I know the current pending licenses is somewhere north of 10,000, but not all those would be pending employment in North Carolina.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
So on hire school psychologists using their national certified school psychologist credential, and we support that it be a continuing license that's issued, because that's exactly what we do with our 6 pathologists. The one thing that I don't think I heard mentioned here, which was brought up at our last PEPSIS meeting, and I think what went to the state board, was that there was another provision added to LIC and 001 outside of that credential, which would be how quickly those licenses get issued to those 2 school psychologists. And I just did a quick survey this morning, and out of 14 districts that we had an opportunity to respond, because a lot of them were closed because of weather, and 5 of those being in the top 10 in size in the state of North Carolina, there are 6 very
Glenda,
Sorry.
we lost you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. But you'll need to
Okay,
repeat
sorry.
yourself.
What was the last thing you heard?
Of
That
the,
you surveyed some folks from and 5 were from big districts.
That's right, I'm sorry. 5 were from the top 10 districts in size that had an opportunity to report. Only had 14 reports up this morning, because I sent it out early. But out of that, there are 268 teacher vacancies in the state of North Carolina. 88 of those are in one district, 75 are in another. There are 51 EC teacher vacancies right now, 60 counselor vacancies, 9 social worker, 8 speech. We have 14 psychologist vacancies. But with that, with the HR folks I'm talking to, it's not the length of time it's taking them to get their license process that's the issue. One, it may be as linked as the fact that the national credential's not used. That may be part of the reason we're not getting more to come to the state. But outside of that, our biggest drawback is in pay. School psychologists can contract with our district and make more money than they can being placed on the North Carolina state salary schedule. And so having to, when we look at facts and numbers, when we're looking to maybe shortages, we have to consider shortages across our education spectrum and not just one category of employees. So I really wanted to just say that this morning and say we totally support what Lynn put out here with the credential, and we support that it be issued as a continuing license as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just want to underscore that you really illustrated the point well around how this is a multifaceted issue that does impact many disciplines, and this is one seemingly easy thing that can be done to help, but it's only one piece of what is going to need to be done to address the issues that exist. And it is across educators, but this is very specific to one particular discipline, of course. Thank you very much.
Now a good time for me to bring up my
I have a
comments.
question, if you don't mind. This is Patrick Miller.
Sure.
I'm trying to understand the reciprocity piece, or if there is reciprocity with North Carolina and the National School Psychologists Association. So is this correct or not correct? If a North Carolina school psychologist who holds a clear North Carolina license, a full continuing license, by virtue of passing the test that we're talking about in this issue, does the National School Psychologists Association honor that testing requirement by granting the national certification?
Yeah, I think if I'm understanding your question correctly, I think that there's a twofold piece to the national credential, and that is the training requirement, just like it is in our state. So the training requirement is not always sixth year level, 60 plus credit hours, and our training programs range all the way up to, I think Western has like 73 credit hours required for their training program. So the minimum is, the sixth year, but that's one piece of it. So no, there isn't that type of reciprocity. You have to get to the national credential by completing the training program and attaining the 147. Now, I will say that our 5 training programs in this state are all NASP approved, and the process for that national credentialing is much easier if you are a NASP approved program. If you are not, there is what I would assimilate with kind of the National Board Certification for Teachers process. If you're not coming out of a NASP approved program to attain your national credential, you have to go through a very extensive kind of portfolio review process. First you have to meet the training requirement and the praxis standard, but they do a very extensive, like 4-month process review of any of those applicants. So no, it doesn't go both ways. But our training programs produce a very easy, streamlined process to the national credential because they're all approved by the National Association.
Is it okay? So, Dr. Miller.
I'm sorry. This is Linda Jones again. I think you mentioned this, but I want to make sure I'm clear. Those states that are producing the surplus,
Mm-hmm.
do those states accept the national credential?
They have not. Nope. And, I think I referenced my hypothesis around that is they don't really need to do anything much because they're training so many school psychologists, most of them can't find jobs up in those states, so they end up defaulting to other states because they have such a high level of training programs. So no, none of those 4 have the national credential recognized. They're in the, 18 states.
HR that we do that in North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that maybe the organization at the state level of your group could really try to work with these other states.
Yes.
It would be good if nationally that was recognized so that these folks are not having those issues from state to state.
Yeah, and we are definitely working with the state association here. I work closely with them and really looking at those 4 states in targeted recruitment efforts. But we also want to get to our neighbors who have recognized the national credential and say, hey, North Carolina is doing this now too, and it should be more streamlined for you, like Virginia, Georgia, and South Carolina have already done.
Dr. Miller, this is Michael Marr. I wanted to make a couple of comments. So I think for the last year at least, we within the commission have had a lot of conversations about reducing barriers for qualified individuals to come into the state and be employed, whether it's teachers or counselors or other school professionals. And I think this is in line with what we've tried to do for the last year. With regard to these school psychologists in particular, so I agree with Glenda that we ought to be recognizing the national credential with a continuing license. I think that we perhaps had erred in where we put the language last month. So last month we approved some new language, the nationally certified school psychologist credential issued by the National Association of School Psychologists will be accepted to the extent that such certification remains aligned with the licensure requirements for the state of North Carolina. Should the requirements change for NCSP certification, NCDPI will reevaluate, determine whether the revised NCSP will continue to be used as an eligibility requirement for the provisional license. It's on page 11 of LICN 001. What I would suggest is, one, it should not read provisional license. We're not going to issue a provisional license to someone who's fully met requirements. We would issue a continuing license, not a provisional. Right. So this, number one, this is not in the right place. I would suggest it needs to be moved to page 6 of LICN 001. Under there, you'll see number 6, student services. That's where these folks fall. I would also recommend that the line on page 6 reads, school psychology will be restricted to the 6th year and doctorate levels in school social work may be earned at the bachelor's level, I would suggest that the next sentence ought to be that previous sentence that I just read with the change from provisional license to continuing license, and then the next sentence, school language pathology, be separated from that paragraph. So that begins a new kind of section or paragraph. And I think that would kind of fix what the issue seems to be. And I think I'm also recommending that we strike the 30-day issue, as that's really procedural in DPI, and it's not really our, within the licensure section, it's I don't necessarily think it's our business to tell the licensure section how to process licenses. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Before we get into that discussion, Dr. Evans has a presentation to make on the feedback that was received from the state board on this issue, and I think that some of the feedback may inform our discussion. So if there are no further questions for Ms. McClure, and I apologize for mispronouncing your name earlier.
That is totally fine. Yes, thank you.
We'll move into Dr. Evans' presentation. And thank you, Ms. McClure, for sharing that with us.
Thank you for the opportunity.
So what I'm going to present on is what Dr. Seiberg talked about during the state board, and comments and conclusions from that conversation. Dr. Seiberg talked about the history of how Pepsi came to talk about national certification for school psychologists, and he reviewed that at the July meeting, the state board requested that this be a topic of discussion at Pepsi to help recognize the national certification for school psychologists, and also consider other school service individuals in the mix, as well as expediting the provisional licensing process for these areas. From there, Pepsi has reviewed that last month, and then we brought it back to the state board. We brought it to the state board last Thursday on October 3rd and presented it to them there for review. And after seeing this presentation and hearing the data that I'm about to share with you, it's been recommended by the state board that it be brought back to Pepsi. So this will be the second time for Pepsi to be able to see this, and the final time for it to be talked about. Dr. Seiberg also made it clear that this was not reciprocity, that if the exam did change or any of the qualifications did change for the national certification, then North Carolina was able to re-examine that process. And then he went over the policy language that was in place that Dr. Marr talked about in the provisional licensing section, with a 30-day turnaround time, and that what I just talked about, the credential being accepted for the provisional licensing, as well as if the requirements change for the certification, then NCDPI would be able to reevaluate whether that would be accepted or not. And then he reviewed what happened during the September Pepsi meeting, and how the Pepsi, during that Pepsi,
Does not belong.
during the September Pepsi meeting, it was approved to recommend it to the board. However, there were concerns raised about the 30-day turnaround time for school psychologists to receive their license, because it would have priority over teachers, and it opens the door for other demands on licensure. And the remaining slides are the data that the state board wants to make sure that Pepsi members see, because this is what was not available to Pepsi members at the last Pepsi meeting. So the first slide talks about from the time an application is submitted, it takes 30 to 45 days to issue any license. And that was reported by NCDPI Licensure Department on 9/27/2018. The next slide talks about the number of school psychology licenses within the past 3 years. So from July 1st, 2015 to June 30th, 2016, NCDPI issued 69 of them. From July 1st, 2016 to June 30th, 2017, NCDPI issued 81 licenses, and from July 1st, 2017 to June 30th, 2018, NCDPI issued 78 school psychologist licenses. And then the last slide talks about how many licenses overall there are that NCDPI issues. So from July 1st, 2018 to June 30th, 2017, NCDPI issued 349 licenses. And from July 1st, 2017 to June 30th, 2018, NCDPI issued 100,460 licenses. And the school psychologist licenses represent 0.08% of all licenses issued by the state. So that's the data that the state board wanted to make sure all Pepsi members were aware of before making any type of recommendation. Are there any questions?
Hey, Kim, this is Ann Bullock. I have a question. Thank you for that. That was really, really helpful.
Sure.
I'm very supportive of having this as an option for school psychologists. I'm sure, as Linda said, the HR folks are. I'm sure that my IAG colleagues agree with me. But I have a question about licensure policy 001 on page 7. On page 7, it talks about, this is following up with what Michael was talking about, but just a different part. It talks about, in the third paragraph, it talks about the student services personnel who are licensed in another state or have 3 or more years of student services school experience and have not passed the required test can basically complete the national board certification to be granted a continuing professional license. So my question is this already in policy in 001, what we're trying to talk about today, which most of us are supportive of? And is it just unclear and in the wrong place? And is it more procedural to change it around like Michael was talking about versus adopting a new component?
Yeah, and they can't actually get the national credential unless they've passed the test. The test is a requirement of the national credential for school psychologists.
And my point is we're saying that the national credential, the national certification is an option here. Is it not an option? Is that not what this is saying?
It is an option because it fulfills those requirements. If it didn't fulfill those requirements, it would not be an option. Does that answer your question?
So to your point, this is Glenda. What I think here is that psychologists are still going to have the option of either taking the North Carolina test or having their national credential, right? We're not removing that option. We're just saying if you have the national credential, you don't have to take the test, which again goes back to making this sound like it really is all procedural.
You have to have the test.
Legislation basically says long as they can.
No,
so
they don't understand you have to have the test.
That have been defined by the state.
No.
It doesn't specify which test in legislation. So it sounds procedural.
This is Wesley Wood speaking, and just looking at that paragraph, I think the issue is the 3 or more year piece. Therefore it's not truly already in place because they have to be out of state and have 3 or more years of experience. So I think that's the part we need to eliminate there.
Right, and this is Ann again, Ann Bullock. I am fine with changing this language to make it more fluid, to what we're trying to do. But I guess my question is, do we need a new policy, or do we just need to procedurally change what's in policy?
Dr. Tomberlin, are you out there? Can you speak to these questions and the rulemaking process and some of the issues related to that?
Yes. One of the things that I've talked with both the State Board and this Commission about is the need for a comprehensive licensure policy revisions. And the reason that is so important is North Carolina has recently determined that the Supreme Court has recently determined that DPI is subject to state rulemaking processes. Therefore, every rule we make, and licensure would be included under this, has to be put before the state rulemaking commission. That is a particularly onerous process and can take a long time to make changes. So it basically is going into administrative code as opposed to just being State Board of Education policy. For that reason, it's really important that we revise the licensure code at a very high level so that we know what we're putting into that, and once we go through that process, we know it's the way we pretty much want it. Procedural issues should be put into a licensure manual, which the state is currently working on, where we can operationalize the policies to make it clear to everyone when we say that you have to, you have to pass these tests or meet these requirements, what are the other options that we would accept as evidence of meeting those requirements? That kind of stuff, to me, should be placed in a procedure or a policy manual that has some flexibility to be changed with the State Board and with the Commission, rather than being placed into administrative code where we would not have easy options to change it should the need arise.
This is Andrew. I'm sorry. Can I throw out one point, Dr. Miller?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. I just in terms, you had mentioned it could take a long time. So for the past almost year now, Pepsi has been making recommendations to the board. The board has been recommending or sending back. This process basically is essentially a two-step process. The recommendation goes to the board thinks about it, and then the following month approves it, or in some cases even fast tracks it. So an idea that comes that germinates from the Pepsi group could take 2 to 3 months in order to convert into an actionable policy. Could you share with the commission here how long, ballpark, this additional layer of rules would cause this process? So we know that the current process is relatively nimble. It takes a couple months to do that. With this new policy or this new law in place, we know how long it's going to take for the rulemaking body. Is it another month? Is it 6 months? Is it a year? Do we know any of that?
Is that for Tom?
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I just realized he was asking me. I don't know. I have not been through this process, but the communication that I've received from the State Board attorneys is that we need to review licensure policy and make sure it is exactly the way we want it, because to change it will take, they said, about a year. So I'm fully supportive of the HR directors on this, and everybody else at the table, that we need a expedited pathway to licensure for these folks. To address the other issue that Dr. Marr raised, this is in the wrong place, because originally the policy was to use the national license as a substitute for the licensure exam, period. It was never presented to us as a substitute for the conditions of a continuing license, which we after reviewing it, we agree that the continuing license is exactly the way to go on this. The question becomes, do we want to put that language in administrative code where we could not possibly change it within the school year that it would affect, should the national license become, you know, separate from the North Carolina requirements for holding the license. Whereas if we put this in procedure in a policy manual, then we would go through our normal procedures to change that policy manual.
This is Ann Bullock again. So I completely agree, because I completely agree that we want this in action sooner than later. And we want this we don't want a small item like this in licensure, which is causing a big issue, to become cumbersome, right? So what would be your recommendation for this commission today in order to move this action forward immediately around this national certification test for school psychologists?
Well, I mean, I can say something. I'm sorry, Dr. Bullock, was that question for me, Tom Tomberlin?
It's either for you or Andrew or for Kim, because it sounds like if we put it in a procedural manual, do we need to vote to do that? I guess I'm talking about logistics here right now. Like, what do we need to do to move this forward? And that might be for you or Andrew or for Kim.
So Dr. Bullock, this is Glenda again. Can I ask a question before one of them answers that? Is there any way that we can do exactly what we do for speech pathology? I think that's page 12, I'm not sure, but in the box there, basically it just says provisional licenses are no longer issued in this area. However, individuals holding non-provisional A-level license must complete the requirements for the M license by whatever. Condense and just put something, and then any other reference to the licensure piece of that would be over in whatever procedural manual or licensure manual that DPI has. And that may be simplifying it way too much, Tom, but I'm not sure why we couldn't do something like that, because high level.
Mr. Snyder's here from legal, and he'd like to say something.
Sure, and this, thank you, Kim. Glenda, I'm not going to address your specific question there, but I'd like for us to be careful about this rulemaking overlay, which is going to complicate matters for this committee, but will ultimately lead to greater certainty for folks in the field about what licensure means. Now, the benefit of putting something in the administrative code is it raises that policy to a level of status of law, which of course is very important with rights that surround licensures and the ability to practice in any of these particular professions in our schools. From a legal perspective, we really like having those rules straightforward and in the administrative code, so that we can defend the consistent actions with respect to granting and revoking licenses. With respect to this issue right now, one could, should the Pepsi Commission choose to endorse the proposal that Dr. Mars put on the table, that can go into LICN 001 as a recommendation that the board could approve, and it would essentially have the effect of a policy that it would guide folks in the field. It would be an important message to the programs that train, educate, and certify school psychologists. What it wouldn't do is have the same force of law should there be any challenge with respect to the granting or revocation of a particular license for these kinds of professionals. So all this to say, we're dipping our toes into this question about rulemaking and the effects of that process, which, as others have indicated, can be up to a year. But the reasons that we really like to put things into the administrative code is to have the firmest of possible ground to defend and justify granting a revocation of licenses.
Eric, this is Patrick. Can I ask you a question?
Please.
If we were, as a commission, to strike the language around the 30-day licensure piece, the language that's left with the granting of the license for those out-of-state psychologists who hold this passing score on this national exam. In your legal opinion as counsel for state board, does that belong more appropriately in policy or in the licensure procedure manual?
Well, I don't know if that's so much a legal question or a decision for the commission, so I don't want to put my thumbs on the scale on this. I think it certainly would be appropriate to put in the policy. One could add it into LICN 001, and I don't think that would be problematic. And for some reasons, it may be, straying from my legal lane here. There may be some very good policy reasons to do that, and message reasons to go ahead and update the policy with the revisions that have been suggested.
So Patrick, are we ready for a motion?
Does the group have any more questions or comments?
This is Freebird McKinney. I want to say from kind of a teacher perspective of just how important kind of on the ground this is, and as those statistics revealed, kind of the imbalance between the number of practitioners we have and the number of students that we serve to really address their individual needs. So I think from a teacher perspective, we would also be fully in support of moving this along so that our students can get that those extra service staff that they require as well. So thank you.
And this is Michael again. I just want to kind of restate. I do think, I understand that it could take some time to have this go through rules making or whatever the process may be, but I think we need to do the right thing rather than the expedient thing. And so for me, I'm still in favor of having this actually put into LICN 001 in the way that we want it, regardless of how long that may take. And I don't think, and I could correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that if it's going through rules making that's going to have a negative impact on anyone who applies during that interim period. They're still going to get treated the same way they are currently being treated. And then I think there's also just a little bit of a misconception. Folks who hold this national credential, based on what I've read, it's not that they have only taken a test. They've actually completed an approved program in another state that actually matches the approved programs that we have in this state. So essentially they've done an equivalent program, which includes coursework, an appropriate internship. They have also completed the licensing exam in order to have that credential, which is what they would have had to do in North Carolina at one of our I believe it's 5 approved programs. So that's it for me.
Dr. Miller, this is Tom Tomberlin. May I say something to that?
Sure.
So, just so everyone's clear, when we presented this to the licensure staff, they agreed that that the national certification meets all the requirements of a North Carolina license, and they have agreed from the day that this was brought up as satisfying those requirements, that they will use the national board certification, the national school psychologist certification to clear a continuing license for an applicant. So this process is happening now, irrespective of what anyone decides whether it belongs in policy or procedure. It is the practice now of NCDPI.
This is Amber. Thank you, Tom, for that. So if this is already happening, and I agree with this happening. So my question goes back to, do we want to send things, I guess my new question is, do we want to send things in chunks forward with 001, or do we want to wait until we have completely redone 001 and include this as part of the revision in the near future as we look at licensure as a whole? We all know that there are other things in 001 that need to be done on this creative level. Like, this is a great creative option for school psychologists. There should be some extra creative options of equivalency competency-based equivalency for other areas.
And this is Linda Jones, and I chair the Licensure Subcommittee, and we have looked at LICN 001, and you know, it's our intent after the state HR conference next week, so that we can get some input on what the committee's worked on, to be able to work with Andrew and Tom to bring that to PEPSIC. And just kind of FYI, we've already got some creative solutions in mind for other areas as well.
Linda, this is Ann again. That's great, and I'm assuming this will be part of that, you know, revision. So I don't know if we want to send things, I'm just talking logistics here, forward twice, this separately than that.
Yeah, and my thought is, you know, if you're going to do it comprehensively. Don't do piecemeal. It makes sense to kind of look at it in totality and push things forward at one time, so we're not having to go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. I would say this though: if we're doing things in practice, then we need to make sure that there's a policy there. So I agree with Michael completely. Expediency is nice and all, but I want to make sure we're doing things the right way. Let's make sure that there's policy that governs what we do.
Right, I completely agree. But I don't know if it's, since it's already in practice, if we need to, I'm just thinking of perhaps moving things forward. Sorry, I know we're spending I'm making a lot of comments about something that I agree with, but I'm just thinking about us looking at it comprehensively and adding this as part of the comprehensive review.
Dr. Bullock, I think we all agree. We're just trying to decide where's the best place to couch the language, to place it. Dr. Tomberlin, in light of that conversation, I'd like to hear from you about including the language as part of an overall comprehensive overhaul of LICN-001 versus or including the language in the licensure procedural manual.
I have no strong opinion on where it exists. I agree with everyone on the call that, just be clear, the reason we can do this without any policy is because the national license satisfies every single requirement we have for the North Carolina requirement, or it exceeds it. So right. It's not that we're doing things outside of policy, it's that we've recognized that this thing does indicate all our requirements have been met exactly. So I don't have an opinion. I'm glad we know this now and that we're aware of this so that we can expedite those licenses as they come in if they have a national certification. Where it belongs in terms of letting the field know and letting the National Association know that we are recognizing them, that I don't have strong opinions on that. We'll put it wherever the commission and the board feel it is the best place that serves the state.
So I
Tom, this is Linda Jones again. We already do this also for our nationally board certified teachers and speech. Is that correct?
National board certification, yes, it is recognized. Those are, in fact, policy decisions because they don't carry the same requirements. Like testing requirements are not a part of that national board certification, or not specifically. And that's why we have it in policy that it is something different that we are recognizing as saying is acceptable. And that is a different situation than we're talking about here. The national license in school social work is not different from our requirements. So if that were the case, if oh, I'm sorry, school psychology. Did I say social work again? So if the case were that the school psychologist license was somehow different, this would have to be in policy, absolutely.
So what I hear you saying is because it's not different, it really doesn't have to be in policy. It can be in the procedural manual.
That is correct. But I do want to recognize the benefit for, of having it. As Mr. Snyder said, there is benefit for having some of these things in policy that sends a very clear and strong communication to the field that this is a path that we're going, that we recognize.
I also just wanted to mention that. So I agree with Ann about the idea of a larger overhaul of LICN 001 and kind of batching a bunch of changes all at one time. But I also want us to recognize that we've made several modifications in the last year to LICN 001. That we've addressed issues as they've come to us, including things like the residency license and the permit to teach. And I have a little bit of a problem with saying, all right, we're going to stop that now and wait and then make all these changes. I think as issues arise, I think it's incumbent upon us to address those issues and not punt them till later. I just have a strong feeling about not pushing off issues that we can handle, that we all seem to be in agreement should happen. So
this is Freebird again. And it seems like we were all pretty much in agreement with it without the state school board, particularly without the 30-day policy. And I think if we can begin to make ourselves competitive with those states around us, help to fill those 75 reported vacancies, help those LEAs that do not have, sorry? Oh, sorry. Help to fill those 13 LEAs that don't actually have full-time school psychologists. I think this speaks to the needs of the students, and we can help move that process along.
This is Ann again. I would say we are doing that through a procedural way. I'm going to go back to things in chunks. And maybe we do stop it at one point if we know we're close to the other. Again, I'm in complete agreement with this as an option.
I'd like to make a motion if I can, Patrick.
Absolutely.
So I'd like to move that we strike the language from the provisional section and we move it to page 6 of LICN 001 and we change provisional license to continuing license under student services. And we eliminate the 30-day.
For the commission, the entire change to the language that you're proposing.
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of that.
Do you mind reading what the revised language was?
Yes, if you go to page 6 of LICN 001, section 6 talks about student services. Just below the 3 degrees, you'll see school psychology shall be restricted to the 6th year and doctorate levels, and school social work may be earned at the bachelor's level. The next sentence I'd suggest inserting begins with the Nationally Certified School Psychologist Credential, NCSP, issued by the National Association of School Psychologists will be accepted for a continuing professional license to the extent that such certification remains aligned with the licensure requirements for the state of North Carolina. Should the requirements change for NCSP certification, NCDPI will reevaluate to determine whether the revised NCSP will continue to be used as an eligibility requirement for the continuing professional license, period. And then there will be a space inserted, and then the speech language pathology licenses sentence will be continued there.
So this is Glenda. I second that motion for just that language.
So just to be clear for the commission, Dr. Marr, what you're proposing eliminates the 30-day piece that was problematic in the first piece that was sent to the state board. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second to add the language proposed by Dr. Marr to page 6 of LICN-001. Is there any further discussion or questions? Hearing none, all in favor of approving this, please say aye.
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 Aye. Is anyone opposed? Okay. We have reached agreement.
kind of,
Go ahead, Glenda.
I'm sorry, I lost everybody, so I didn't hear anything after the second. So you said something back to be clear, and I missed every bit of that. Could you repeat that for me?
I just asked that to be clear, we were eliminating the 30-day piece that was in the first policy language that was sent to the state board.
Okay.
And we've already voted and it's passed.
Thank you. I vote too. Thanks.
I don't think there's any other business. Dr. Evans, have we completed all the business for today?
That is correct.
Great. So thank you, commission members, advisors, and staff for your preparation for the discussions. I remind everyone that our next standing meeting will be held in the State Board meeting room on Thursday, November 8th from 9 to noon. We've now completed our meeting. Unless there's additional business, I will ask for a motion to adjourn.
Leslie Wood, motion to adjourn.
Thank you. We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Freeburg McKinney, seconds.
Thank you, sir. We have a motion and a second to adjourn. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
We are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.